I'm happy to be here. I chair the Global Agenda Council on the Gender Gap, and we have had a wonderful group working with us very hard over the last year. But also we have the wonderful opportunity to build on something which the forum has now done for 3 years, which is to publish a global gender gap report with a very carefully constructed index that measures gender gaps around the world, tries to do that with not looking at the effect of economic development, saying that in developed societies there can be gender gaps as well as in developing societies, and looking also at various kinds of gaps. We identified 4: gaps in health, gaps in education, gaps in the economy, and gaps in politics. Now, I want to say that I solved my problem of the slides flipping and my having to flip my presentation to having a few slides that are really just wonderful pictures of gaps. And I will continue to talk about it as we have a picture of reflecting education gaps, political gaps, and business gaps. What we think we can do at this point is really build on a terrific amount of knowledge that has been created around the world, that's being created around the world, about what works, whether you're looking at closing a gender gap in education. And by the way, the question raised earlier about women's education, if you look at that first slide I had, you'll see that education is one of the areas where around the world basically looking at both developing societies and developed societies, that's an area where there's been a tremendous amount of success of closing the gender gap. It doesn't mean that it's closed, but relative to the economic opportunity and participation gap, or relative to the political representation gap, we have made enormous progress around the world on education and on health. We believe that we have a much better sense now of what works in education, in health, in political empowerment, and in business and economic opportunity. And so what we want to do is to create an institute for closing the gender gap, which would have as its objectives to basically bring together what we know, to organize it, and to make it user-friendly, to disseminate that information to interested organizations, whether they are providers of education, providers of, whether they are political leaders at the level of a state, at the level of a township, at the level of a national government, whether they are CEOs looking for, well, what really does work to retain talented women in the workforce. So we think we can build an institute that basically organizes and disseminates research, but also helps create research. We would put together a roster, indeed we're doing it already, of what we know. That will generate some information about what we don't know. There is a tremendous opportunity to use new randomized, experimental, behavior science-based research to actually assess objectively and independent of development level what works, whether it's in, for example, does a quota system work in corporate board representation? Some of developing countries have situations now where women, there are quotas for women or assignments of women to head certain local government organizations. That appears to work in terms of if you follow through what happens to women in politics, starting at that level, you see progress. So we can actually create knowledge where there's gap and organize knowledge where there is already existing knowledge. And then, of course, dissemination would be a very important part of the Institute's goal here. And that very much is about, I would say, I go to the marketing people. This is viral marketing. This is networking. This is creating the best possible go-to website in the world. So if a CEO or if a head of a political party or if the head of a school wants to know, gee, what actually would help with girls' education in math and science, or what helps with keeping women with MBAs from dropping out of the workforce 3 years into their careers, they would say, oh, I know where to go to find that out, the Institute for Closing the Gender Gap. And then finally, what we would hope to do is, after we've generated this wonderful go-to site with the best possible information, and by the way, we think this is unique because it involves 4 different kinds of gender gaps and is open to development level information from around the world. We want information from what works in the poorest countries, what works in the richest countries. So we believe we would have a very broad outreach. And then finally, we believe that we would have a role for advocacy, because once we became the go-to place for information, those leaders of organizations, from the top head of state to the smallest primary school under a tree, would want to work with us to find out what works to make continued progress on closing the gender gap. So we're very excited about this, and we think it works very well, building on a substantial commitment of the World Economic Forum to building this gender gap index, which, by the way, is already becoming input into research and how organizations look at themselves. Thank you.
So Laura, good. So the people you would want gathering around your whiteboard would be folks who are interested in the go-to site, building it out and using it to address specific problems in their communities. Is that?
And I would say people who are in the area of gender research, who want to make sure that we know what they have found out, or have a great new design for an experiment to look at, say, how a particular cash transfer system would help women save. So I think it's all levels.
Super.
Okay?
Any quick reactions, connections to Laura's